Hey, welcome back to reading through the Bible. It's day 9 of 365. We're in Genesis 20 through 22, Matthew 7, 15 through 29, Psalms 9, 1 through 12, Proverbs 2, 16 through 22. So let's jump into Old Testament. Back in Genesis, we have Abraham pretending that his wife is his sister because he's afraid that the king of this area is going to kill him, etc., etc. Basically, he's not believing in God's protection, God's safety and deliverance in this instance. But nevertheless, God protects him, the whole situation. Then yesterday we talked about how Sarah was laughing at God for saying that she was going to give birth in her old age. And so Isaac is born, the son of Abraham and Sarah. And so then we also have Sarah asking for Hagar to be sent away, God allowing it, Hagar and Ishmael being out in the desert, and then God providing for them, and then turning Ishmael into a great people, a great nation as well. Then, as we round this section out, we have the last great story, per se, of Abram's life. And this is chapter 22, where we have Abram sacrificing Isaac on the altar. And so this is less about trying to kill a person and more about, is Abram willing to sacrifice the one thing he's been waiting for his entire life? Is he going to put the gift above the giver of the gift, or is he going to hold on to that too tightly and he's not going to give God his rightful place? And so Abram does the thing that God's challenging him to. He brings his son up to the altar. He takes him to the top of the mountain. He goes to sacrifice him. God stops him. And then God provides a ram to be the sacrifice in his stead. So it's a really interesting story how it all parlays and plays out. And so then let's jump forward into Psalms 9. There's a really interesting verse in there, and I've kind of talked about it before, about anxiety and depression and how that's a kind of a resounding theme that tends to come up during the Psalms. But there's a verse in there in this section that we're reading, and it says, in verse 12, he says, "He does not forget the cry of the afflicted." And a lot of us will probably hear that as someone who's being attacked or someone who is being kind of beaten down. But that also can be someone who's being afflicted by something. And so I think that a lot of us may be struggling with where our heads are at mentally. And so that's some hope there that, God does not forget those who cry out to him. And in Proverbs 2:20, we have another great verse. We've been talking about the wisdom crying out. And so we get this resounding echo here. And it says, "So you will walk in the way of good men and keep to the paths of the righteous." So learning to walk in wisdom, learning deep truths, important spiritual things, learning what we should be doing in our life is really important and effectual. And so lean into that. And the reminder and kind of the promise there is that if you're going to lean into wisdom, you're going to walk that, is that you will end up walking in the way of good men and you will keep to the paths of the righteous. And so lastly, I want to end up with our verses out of Matthew. And so this is still in the Sermon on the Mount section. So this is one of Jesus' big teaching moments that has really been compiled together, and a few neat verses that pop out of there. So chapter 7, verse 24, Jesus says, "Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them may be compared to a wise man who built his house on the rocks." And so yet again, we have this whole wisdom thing, how being in tune and obedient to God is where true wisdom lies. And for Jesus in this moment, it's really interesting how he puts these phrases at the beginning. He says, "Everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them." Not just, oh yeah, you listen to something really neat, congratulations, I'm going to just throw that in the back of my head. It's like, okay, I've learned something. Now what am I supposed to do with it? There's a call to action. And so there's this really neat phrase inside of being studious in the word and godly, is that you have both theology and then you have action, right? Like, how do I put those things into practice, okay? And so what I believe about God should influence my actions and how I do things. And then as we slide down to the very end of chapter 7, instead of getting Jesus' words here, we get kind of the summarization. Like, he's been doing all this teaching, all this great stuff is happening. So 28-29, it says, when Jesus had finished these words, the crowds were amazed at his teaching. Like, you ever got done with a big lecture, like sitting there and listening to like a really wise person talk on a really important subject or something, and you just sit back and you're like, that dude knows what he's talking about. Like, he didn't just know what he's talking about, like, he's inspired me while I'm talking about it. And so it's kind of to that level, if not higher, in this regard. And then the phrase that they use after it, that they're amazed at his teaching, it was, for he was teaching them as one having authority and not as one of the scribes. Jesus is not just someone who echoes thoughts, but he is the guarantor or the creator of authority, in this sense that if we look at John chapter 1, it says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And then the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and that's Jesus. And so when then this moment when the people are recognizing that he's speaking as one who has authority, they are catching glimpses. They're not tying the two things together, but they're catching glimpses of his authority being the beginning of all things. And because he's been the beginning of all things, he gets to teach in such a way that it's like, this is truth. So I challenge you to dig in, read the words for yourself. I hope that you're having a great week. God bless and enjoy it.